Hello and welcome to the Christopher Hall Training Podcast, where we're going to be talking about spinal muscles. We're going to talk about the deep layer, let's call them the mid layer, and then the superficial layer. We're going to talk about their anatomy. We're going to talk about what they do, and we're going to then start talking about exercises for them, because I want to bring into perspective the function of the core and the lower back, because that will inform how we go about training it. So let's get started. If you want to build your core strength and stability, please do hit the link below. You'll go through to my How to Build Core Strength and Stability 12-week online program, which builds on everything that I'm about to talk about with regards to the anatomy of the core, function of the core, and the exercises that you choose. Let's first start talking about the deepest layer, and then what we'll do is we'll sort of build out the torso. So if we go deep and talk about, first of all, we'll just talk about the spine, just so we sort of build the structure. So we've got vertebrae that sit on top of each other, which are then sort of separated by discs. That obviously goes all the way up the spine. Lumbar spine, thoracic spine, cervical spine. Obviously, we're just going to put most of our function on the lumbar spine, but it will naturally, because it is sort of one unit, we will talk about thoracic and cervical spine to some degree. What we'll also discuss is something called fascia, because that's a very important part of this, because it's what kind of brings it all together. Now, as I mentioned, we've got vertebrae separated by discs. What we then have are ligaments that they're basically there to give it a basic stability. So if you took all the muscles away, the vertebrae would kind of sit on top of each other because the ligaments are sort of holding them in place. If you sort of touch them and push them, it'll all sort of fall down. They're not there to give any sort of great stability. It's much more there just for a very basic stability. Obviously, they do have a role with regards to sort of movement. They will restrict movement in a certain way because they do have certain lengths, but also in injury or in the process of injury, they can do what's called creep. So basically, they can lengthen. The more time you spend with a flexed spine, the more the ligament will learn to stay in that sort of lengthened position, and that will influence how well it can stabilize, and then you start getting your problems type of thing. So that's our basic structure of what the spine is. What we can now start to do is we can now start to sort of wrap muscles into that. So we would start with the deepest spinal layer. And what we've got here are the ones that, not that they do attach to the spine. They are the deepest layer, but other muscles attach to the spine, but they're a part of the midsection or the middle layer as well. But with that said, so you've got multifidus. Now multifidus goes all the way up the spine, and in a general sense, it kind of goes from vertebra to vertebra, or one part of it will cover 2 to 3 vertebrae. So you've got multifidus, and it kind of goes up either side of the spine. Then you've got other muscles, which go from the spinous processes, which are on the back of the vertebra. So if you sort of bend forward and you can feel the knobbly bits going up your spine, they're your spinous processes. So they've got muscles that go in between them. So they go from spinous process of the lower vertebra to the one above it, and then continues all the way up the spine. Then you've got other ones which go from transverse process to transverse process. So you've got so you've got knobbly bits that stick out the side of the spine as well. So you've got the ones that stick out the back that you can feel, and then you've got ones that sort of stick out slightly diagonally, but they're called transverse processes. They've got muscles in between them, like the spinous processes. And then you've got ones that cross from spinous process to transverse process. So you've got these sort of, let's just call them longitudinal ones or vertical ones, and then you've got diagonal ones. What we then do is we then build out into the middle section of the spine, or the mid layer of muscles, let's call it. So here you would have things like, or muscles like QL, quadratus lumborum. Now this muscle, if you can imagine, you've got the top of the pelvis here, you've got the 5 lumbar vertebra, and then you've got the base of the ribs. The quadratus lumborum basically goes from L5, so the side of L5 down to the pelvis, the side of L4 down to the pelvis, the side of L3 down to the pelvis. So it acts like, literally like guy wires on a tent. And that goes all the way up L2, L1, and then across the across the bottom of the ribs as well. So this is the muscle that kind of brings the pelvis, the lumbar spine, and the ribs together. It acts like a buttress, which is basically, again, it's like the next layer of stability. It's not, well, which we'll come on to, it's not necessarily a movement muscle, but we'll talk about that in the next section. I'm going to continue going around some muscles first. Then we would have the psoas muscle. Now, the psoas muscle is a hip flexor, but it adjoins L5, L4, L3, L2, L1, and then you start getting bits that go up into T12 and up into the diaphragm as well. So it's quite an influential muscle. And that again will help stabilize the spine. But in stabilizing the spine, its main role is to flex the hip. But in order to flex the hip, it has to stay. When it contracts, it stabilizes the spine, and that can add compression onto the spine. So we've got QL and we've got psoas. Then you've got transverse abdominis, which is a deep-lying abdominal muscle, which basically, again, it wraps around the torso, sort of from the spine all the way around the front. Then on the sort of the bottom of that, you would have the pelvic floor muscles, and then you'd have the diaphragm on the top, which is when people start talking about a cylinder, that's kind of what they're talking about. You've got the muscles of the spine, you've got the pelvic floor, you've got the transverse abdominis, and you've got the diaphragm that sits on the top. Then we come to the more outer layer. So if you were to contract certain muscles, you'd be able to see them. So on the back, you've got longissimus and iliocostalis. So longissimus is closer to the spine, one of the spinal erectors or erector spinae. And then you've got iliocostalis, which sits outside of that. Then you will have latissimus dorsi, which is another spine stabilizer. Then you will have internal and external obliques. Obviously, internal obliques are slightly deeper than external obliques, because external obliques are the ones on the outside. Then you've got rectus abdominis on the front, which is known as the six-pack. And then what's wrapping all of this together is on the back, it's known as the thoracolumbar fascia. So a lot of these superficial muscles, they join into the thoracolumbar fascia. Now the thoracolumbar fascia, basically, it's like a diamond shape, a crude way of describing it, a diamond shape that sits over the lower back. And a lot of these muscles join into it. What this tissue does is it joins again onto the spinous processes of the vertebra. And a part of its role is stability. And I'll explain that again in the next section when we talk about function. Then what you have is the abdominal fascia, which basically when you see a stripped back image of the body and you see the rectus abdominis muscles and then you see the white bits in between, that's it's all the same tissue, but it will be a part of the abdominal fascia. So it's all the same. The thoracolumbar fascia and the abdominal fascia is essentially the same tissue. It's just a slightly different part of it. So that is the basic anatomy of the torso. So you've got, building out from the spine, you've got the deep lying muscles that join segments of the spine together and the transverse and spinous processes. Then it builds out, and then it builds out into the superficial muscles. So it goes mid-layer, superficial muscles. What we're now going to do, now that we've kind of got that picture of what the torso looks like and the layers of it, what we'll now do is we'll start describing the function of it. So what are all these muscles doing? I've talked about stability. I've mentioned that some of them aren't movement muscles like QL. But what we'll do is we'll go through each layer and we'll start talking about their function or their role within the abdomen and how it all works. So how does all these muscles work? How does it all come together? Do we need to do strength training for it? Well, the simple answer, I'm going to talk about that in part 3, but the sort of simple answer is no. So let's start with the deepest layer. So let's go back to multifidus and the muscles that go between the transverse processes and the spinous processes. So these muscles, they have a very dense neural network, let's say, or neural structure, whatever you want to call it. So these muscles are, or their primary function is postural feedback. It's not, I wouldn't even say it's necessarily postural control. It's postural feedback. So what it's trying to do is let the central nervous system know, the brain and spine, or spinal cord. It's trying to let that structure know where the spine is. Is it flexed? Is it rotated? Is there a micro movement occurring? So is one vertebra slightly moving more than it should, and then it will sort of create a muscle spasm in a certain area. So all it's trying to do is trying to understand where the spine is in space. So am I rotated to the right, to the left? Am I flexed? Am I extended? It's trying just to pick up that information and feed it back to the central nervous system, so the central nervous system can then send out the necessary signals to the necessary muscles to be able to contract, relax, whatever it needs to do. Because there are people, I'll say, there are people on the internet that have certain social media accounts, and they talk about these in a strength or from the perspective of strength. These muscles don't really have a great deal of strength, and they're not offering you a great deal of strength. They do have that, and they do have that ability because they are there. They will give an initial amount of stability, but they are so, their control is so unconscious, you don't really know what you're contracting and when you're contracting. So you can't train these muscles. And you certainly can't train them like you train your biceps. Obviously, when you do a bicep curl, you can feel it, you're in control of it, very conscious control of it. These muscles aren't like that. They're very proprioceptive, they're very postural. It's all about feedback with these muscles. It's all about giving, letting the central nervous system know what's happening. But as a secondary role, they do have, again, a basic stability, just like ligaments do, that sit on the back and the front of the spine. They have a basic stability. When we start moving out into the middle layer and out into the superficial layer, that's when we really start getting the stability and the strength elements. So In fact, what I will say is I'll start this part by saying the core, talking about the core as a whole, and saying the role of the core is about transferring force and stabilizing the spine, which would bring in posture and things like that. If or when we talk about the transferring of force, what we're trying to, or where we're trying to transfer the force is either from the arms to the legs, or from the arms and then out, from the legs and out, or from the legs to the arms, or from the arms to the legs. And I'll talk a bit more about that when we come to the exercises. But if we start from that perspective, it changes how we understand the core's working, which then will change the exercises that we choose. So the mid and superficial layer is there to hold the spine in place. Now this does a number of things. It distributes load around the core. When you break posture during an exercise or during a movement, if there was 100 units of load and you maintain posture of the spine, that 100 units of load would be spread around the torso much more evenly. Now it will depend on the movement how evenly, but it will be much more evenly. So again, another crude way of explaining this is if we said there will be 25 units on the back of the core, 25 units on the front of the core, 25 units on the right, and 25 units on the left. That's the kind of thing that would happen if you maintain posture during a lift or an exercise, whatever. If you break that posture as you're lifting, those units of load will concentrate more in one area. It will still have a certain amount on the front, on the right, on the left, and on the back. But if you break into flexion, as an example, you will bring more of that load to the back, or to the back of the torso, which is kind of where the spine is. So a lot more load will go on the spine. That's where you then start unnecessary overloading the spine with exercise. This again is where people start to talk about, well, we need to train that, we need to load that. But if we talk about transferring of force, if we bring that into it, when you break posture during an exercise or a movement, you get what's called an energy leak. So you've generated a lot of force in the legs. If we use throwing as the example, you want obviously the force to go out the hand. What then happens is you want that 100 units of force to be taken from the legs, through the torso, down the arm, and out where the ball goes. That's what you're aiming for. Now, if you break posture, when we talk about exercises, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. But for now, because there is potentially a rotation of the spine, but I'm going to talk about that later, so don't question it just yet. So when you want that force going out through the hand, so you want the force to go from the legs, up the torso, and out the arm. If you maintain proper posture, you will get more of that going out. So let's just say you're going to lose some force somewhere. So let's just say you lose 10%, and so you get 90% of the force generation in the legs going up through the torso, down the arm, and out where the ball wants to go. Now, if you break that posture, you will get an energy leak. So you will only get 80%, 70%, 60%, 50%, whatever it may be. Same as when you lift off the floor. If you do a deadlift off the floor, you generate the force in the legs, but you want to be able to transmit that onto the bar. So it needs to go up the torso, down the arms, and through the hands into the bar. So you lift the bar. Again, if you break posture, you lose force. So it's known as an energy leak. So by training that, you're concentrating load and you're losing energy, or you're losing force to be able to lift. So with the midsection, so all the midsection muscles and the superficial muscles, they help that happen. They help that because what happens in the core is we create something called intra-abdominal pressure. Now, intra-abdominal pressure is the pressure on the inside of the abdomen. So it is a force that is pushing out. Now, your muscles contract and hold that force in, and that's what gives you the stiffness through the torso. So when I've said in the past, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that's what I mean. Because if you overtrain one muscle, then your core can't hold the intra-abdominal pressure in. And if you look at engineering, this is known as hoop stresses, which is basically the force holding so you've got pressure pushing out and you've got a force holding in. That's a hoop stress. That's what your torso is there to do. So when you're lifting off the floor, that's why you want to maintain position. Now, with throwing, there is a rotation of the spine. With a golf swing, there's a rotation of the spine. Now, that's different than a deadlift. So we have to understand the difference, because if we deadlift with a flexed spine and we go from flexion to extension, then you're not maintaining the intra-abdominal pressure that you should be maintaining. You're getting an energy leak. So what you start to understand is that, hang on a minute, all these muscles are trying to create something. And the best sort of metaphor I've been able to do, it's a carbon fibre structure. So if you know what carbon fibre is, it's this like a lattice of fibres that overlap each other. Or if you've worked with wood, or you know wood, you've got plywood. So again, you lay fibres down in opposing directions, and it creates a very strong yet somewhat flexible material. That's kind of what your core is. With the muscles that overlap each other, with the three layers, the intra-abdominal pressure, intra-abdominal fascia, thoracolumbar fascia, all of this is creating one unit that's very strong, because all of the fibres crisscross each other. They're not all in the same direction, much more like a thigh muscle or a bicep muscle is. So we have to think about it in that way. So the different structure of the core means we train the core differently to the limbs, because the limbs are there as power production. The core is there to transfer that power or that force through the torso wherever it needs to go. So what we will do in the next part is we'll start looking at exercises that essentially fulfill what I've described so far from the torso. And when it comes to training the torso, there are different types of exercise. So as I've mentioned in the previous part, we've got lifting, so we've got heavy lifting, and we've got a throw or a golf swing. So these are different mechanisms within the core. And all of them need proprioceptive control. Now, as I've mentioned, you can't directly train the deepest layer because it's very unconscious and it's all about feedback. You're not there to develop those muscles from the perspective of hypertrophy. You don't really need them to get bigger. It doesn't really serve any purpose to get them bigger. So it's all about proprioceptive control, so holding posture. So when we talk about a heavy lift, we would talk about maintaining posture of the spine. Now, the ideal posture is the neutral posture or the natural curves of the spine. Why? Because it's what distributes the load most effectively around the torso and doesn't concentrate it on certain tissues, which puts them at greater risk to fail. Now, if the spine is flexed when we lift, because we're lifting a box off the floor, it's in an awkward position and we need to round the spine. If we round the spine, but if we brace the torso as best we can in that rounded position, it's going to be more protected. The worst thing you can do with a spine is go through full flexion and extension under load. So if it's body weight and there is very little load, you have much more license to flex and extend the spine because the load is that much lower. If you are a power lifter or a strongman and you can lift 100, 200 kilos off the floor, if you were asked to lift 50 kilos, you could probably do that with a flex spine because it wouldn't be a huge amount of load for a person like that. But if someone who isn't a power lifter, that doesn't exercise, if they were asked to lift the same 50 kilos, they would have to go about it like a power lifter would, lifting 200 kilos. So there's a relative nature to this that we have to understand. We also have to understand that there are different types of movement and exercises. And that is that there are high force, low velocity exercises, i.e. heavy exercises done in a slow way, and light exercises, so low force, high velocity, but very fast, a golf swing. So these need to be trained differently. So when you see golfers, or if there are golfers out there that only train strength training, they are diminishing their ability to perform a golf swing well because they're taking away the elastic nature that their body requires. That doesn't mean they shouldn't do strength training, but it doesn't want to be a dominant part of their training program. They want to have exercises that create an elastic nature to their body. This is why kettlebells are so good. That's why I talk about them a lot. Then you've got deadlifts on the other end of the scale. So if we start out from that perspective, is that when it comes to exercise, we aren't going to train the deepest level because they're proprioceptive control, posture control. They will kind of be done by default, but we have to understand what exercises we are doing. And there are two types. There are heavy, slow at one end of the spectrum, and there are light and fast at the other end of the spectrum. What we then have to understand is that who needs which one and when. So a power lifter or strongman will need heavy, slow and controlled, or the majority, vast majority, like that. And a golf player will require lighter, faster as its primary makeup of the program at the other end of the spectrum. But that doesn't, again, mean they shouldn't do strength training. It just means it doesn't want to be a priority for them or a significant proportion of their program. So if we start from that perspective, so when we are performing the deadlift, what we need to be able to do is maintain that posture and lift through that posture with good postural control. What that will do is, because it's a heavy load, that will create a lot of intra-abdominal pressure, so the force going out, which requires the muscles to contract to hold those forces in. That's what gives you your core strength. It's not necessarily training the muscles per se. If you load the torso in a logical way and sensible way, and you build the ability of the muscles to hold in the intra-abdominal pressure that's trying to push out, that's your core strength. What you then need is the ability to do that over a prolonged period of time. So you need to build endurance into that, which basically requires you to do it multiple times. Now, I'm talking from the perspective of lifting something heavy, what's required for it. If we look at beginners in a second, we'll look at how to build all of that up. So we've got the deadlift. So as I've mentioned, the deadlift, you generate the force in the legs, or certainly the lifting force in the legs. You maintain, so let's just say it's 100 kilos for argument's sake. You create the force to lift the 100 kilos. You maintain the posture of the spine, and what that does is if you maintain posture in the arms and shoulders, it means that the weight will lift off the floor. If you start lifting the hips and the spine bends, you don't lift the weight off the floor because the spine is bending, because you're saying that my core isn't strong enough to lift that weight. The hips are because they're starting to lift, but the spine isn't. So we maintain the posture. When we maintain the posture, that will activate all those superficial muscles, and conscious control, you will get the abdominals as well. So that is the transferring of force in a deadlift, which goes from the legs through the torso and down the arms. And if the spine bends, we get the energy leak and the concentration of force, which leaves those tissues, or where that leak is, more vulnerable to injury. If we then go on to the other end of the scale and we talk about the light exercises, and what I should say is with the heavy, slow and controlled exercises, that's where the abdominal brace comes in and holding stiff, because you need to hold stiff to hold the posture. If we go to the other end of the scale and we go to the golfer as the example, now, or the throwing athlete, so a baseball pitcher or a cricket bowler, whatever it may be, their requirements are very different to the lifter. So the requirements over here are they need to train pulses. So if we take the golf swing as the example, you start with the club next to the ball, which is on the floor. And then you go into a backswing. So as you initiate the backswing, there is initial pulse of the core. As you lift it through, the muscles will dampen their activity. And then when you get to the top of the swing, they will repulse. And you get that initial pulse. Again, as they come back down, they will dampen their activity, and the activity of the muscle will dampen. And then when it comes to strike the ball, there will be another pulse. So it's contract, relax, contract, relax, contract. And then as you go through the follow through, there will be another relaxation, and then you bring the club down. So this mechanism is very different because they are transferring their force differently. You don't transfer the force all the way through the swing. You transfer the force with the pulse. That's how you transfer the force in light, elastic, fast movements. It's done in that pulse, and that's what they need to train. So they need to be training those pulses. It's the same with someone that kicks, it's the same with someone that punches, it's the same with someone with throws. Obviously the mechanism is different, the pattern is different, but that underlying principle of contract, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax it sort of holds all the way through. It's universal. So they are transferring the force when they pulse. So if they pulse slightly early or slightly late, then they get their energy link, then they get their increased risk of injury. But if they tune that, that's where they then get technique. That's where things become effortless. So when you see a professional golf player, for example, hit the ball very far and it looked effortless, that's because they're tuned in and they've got that timing to do that swing, to do those pulses and relax, contract, relax, contract. That's what technique and effortless performance is. It's that turning on and turning off, or heightening activity and dampening activity, and knowing when to do it. And when they time it right, that's when it looks most effortless. When they time it wrong, that's when it starts to look like, oh, that looks a bit off. That doesn't look quite right. And that's what kind of happens. So that's at the two extremes of performance, if you will. So that's like the tip of the pyramid. Now what we've got to understand is how to get to that point. So if we are beginners, let's say. So first of all, we need proprioceptive control. We need to know where our body is and what it's doing. So just as a beginning point, we don't just go into this complex exercise and start doing these very elaborate exercises, because when I would ask people that I work with, can you feel what your hip is doing there? Can you feel what your shoulder is doing there? Can you feel what your spine is doing there? Oh, no. I just trying to focus on doing the exercise, just trying to move the weight from A to B. That's all I was focused on. I don't know what my hip was doing, don't know what my shoulder was doing, don't know what my spine was doing, couldn't feel any muscles. It was just very narrow focus. I need to get the weight from A to B. So that tells me they don't have proprioceptive control. What they have is the ability to get a weight from A to B. That's where I'm saying most of the industry is, until you build that proprioceptive control. Okay, through that large movement, how do we get it from A to B? Where the hip does this, the spine does this, the shoulder does this, then it does that, then A, B, C, D, so on and so forth. And then you should be able to go through that as you're doing the movement. You should be able to check that as you're doing the movement. That's proprioceptive control. That can be done. So you start so this is an example that I've used in many tutorials, and there are a lot of other ones out there. But so we start with a plank. A lot of people say don't need to use plank, don't do that, blah 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 blah. I'm not using it because I want you to use a plank. I'm using it because I want you to feel your abdominals working. I want you to feel the brace working. I want you to be able, when you're in that position, to be able to push your shoulders down and feel your lats. I want you to be able to build that proprioceptive control without any movement. So I want you to build the stiffness. That's the first thing I want you to build. Then we can start layering in movement. Okay, let's stay in the plank, but let's lift an arm up and let's keep the hips still. Okay, your hips are moving. Can you feel they're moving? Yes, I can feel them moving. Well, when the right hip wants to kick upwards, try and push it back down. And then when they do it, okay, I've got that. Okay, so we're building proprioceptive control. What will also kind of come as a natural part of that is endurance. Because we're going to be doing it for a period of time, we're going to hold the plank for a period of time, feel all the muscles. We're going to move the arm for a few reps. And then, again, we're going to feel that. So endurance is going to be built as a natural consequence. So we build the proprioceptive control, we build the endurance. What we then do is we then start getting them up on their feet and we start building movement part by part. Now, what I mean by that is if we take a throw, for example, it's a rotational exercise. So what I want people to be able to do is rotate from the hip and not the spine. So we choose exercises that rotate from the hip and we just get them rotating at the hip and we keep the shoulders and the hips in line. That's what we do to start with. What we then are able to do, like a golf swing, is we separate them and then you create the pulsing action that comes with that protects the spine. So this is where a lot of people lose the understanding that, oh no, we need to load the spine and we need to move it. If you look at the anatomy, that's the worst thing you can do. If it's a light weight, you can do it. If it's a heavy weight, it's not a great thing to do for the spine. But as I mentioned before, if you've got a beginner doing it and you ask them to lift a heavy weight and do that, it's going to be much more of a problem than if you've got a power lifter and you ask them to lift 50 kilos to do it. So if you get a power lifter to move the spine with 50 kilos, it'll probably be fine. But if you get a beginner to do that with 50 kilos, it will probably be a problem. You may have to ask them to do it with 10 or 5 or whatever it may be, because you're adapting that relative load on the spine. So then you start building the dynamic control through the torso, so you're able to protect it with movement, or with pulsing, sorry, but also you build performance. So it's a double-edged sword, but in a positive way, because when you can get bracing right during a heavy load, you get more transfer of force and you get more distribution of load. So that's your double-edged sword that's going to improve your performance and minimise your risk of injury. When you're moving things fast, like in sports and things, again, you've got the double-edged sword. If you can get the pulse right, which is like a micro brace, if you can get that right, you enhance performance and you reduce load on the spine, and in some respects, you protect it. So those are the general principles of how you build a core, how you build a torso. So you have to start simple and you have to build up. The problem with a lot of the industry is that it goes the other way. They start off with the cool, complicated stuff and make people think they're doing a good thing, where they may be, but they may also be adversely loading joints and muscles and tissues and so on and so forth, putting themselves at risk of injury. So it's about being sensible with it. But hopefully, now that I've gone through the anatomy, the sort of the functional anatomy, and or described the function of the anatomy, and then put exercises on top, you can sort of see the logic as to how I've come to the conclusion. If you work from exercise backwards into anatomy, it's the same sort of story. If you work from anatomy out into exercise, it's the same story. So hopefully this has been helpful. It may well be a slightly new idea, but hopefully it's been helpful. It's given you some fresh thinking with regards to exercise, and it will hopefully build better bodies in the future. So if you've enjoyed the content of this video, hit the like button. If you learned something new, hit the thanks button. If you want to watch more of this, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon. And if you have got a comment or a question, stick it down below as well.